Welcome to Business Talk here on Business Tech, where we're talking to some of the world's top thinkers when it comes to geopolitics and the real economy as well. And we know that runaway inflation is probably one of the most challenging macroeconomic problems facing the world today. Certainly, if you look at what the World Bank's chief economist for Africa, Andrew Dablin, said recently at the launch of their Africa region report, he reckons that sub-Saharan Africa really should try and stamp out inflation as quickly as we can. He was launching the World Bank's Africa Pulse report, and he said that the Russia-Ukraine conflict had just accelerated already upward trending inflation in the region. Now, I think it's a bit of a debatable point, certainly given in South Africa that our inflation has barely breached the upper band of 6%, and given some of the differences between emerging and developed economies. But it's an interesting time, nevertheless, to be talking to Ricardo Hausmann, who's director of Harvard's Growth Lab at the Harvard Kennedy School. Ricardo, thank you very much for joining us. You've really got a special connection to South Africa because between, was it 2005 and 2008, as I recall, you chaired the International Panel on ASGISA, as it's known in South Africa, the Accelerated and Shared Growth Initiative, which was an effort by the South African government to get the world's top thinkers to advise us on our economic growth program. But I want to dial it back, and before we get stuck into the South African focus of this conversation, just to explain exactly what it is that the Harvard Growth Lab does.
Well, I mean, I'm a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, and we think of ourselves as a school of public policy. My view is that public policy is to economics what medicine is to biology, in the sense that, knowing more advances in biology are very good for medicine, but you wouldn't go get treated by a biologist. Because in order to be treated, you have to know much more than just biology. You have to know the whole set of ideas of not just what is the nature of the world, but how to change the world, how to cure disease, how to cure a patient, and so on. So in the same logic, public policy benefits from developments in economics, but it's not just economics, because you're really trying to think about changing the world, helping the patient, fight the disease. And the way the Harvard Medical School teaches is by having these teaching and research hospitals where you cannot form a new doctor unless you send him or her to a real hospital with real patients to work under an attending physician, and then in that context, maybe to try out new drugs, try out new treatments, and document them, publish them, and so on. So the same thing here. That our view is that the Kennedy School needs a teaching hospital, and we are a teaching hospital, teaching and research hospital. We do research on issues of growth, of sustainable, inclusive growth, from a more academic point of view, where we have postdocs that are trying to advance sort of like the theoretical understanding of these phenomena. But we have a very large group of what we call policy research, where we engage with countries, with real patients on their challenges. And at any point in time, we're in about 8 different countries right now, including South Africa, but Ethiopia, Namibia, Jordan, Colombia, the United States, Kazakhstan, etc., and Emirates. And finally, we create these tools. Because when you go to see a doctor, they might order an X-ray, they might order a blood test. That means that there's technology to diagnose, there's technology to fix things. So we try to develop those technologies and to put them out there. So we created this Atlas of Economic Complexity, which looks at what are the productive capabilities of every country in the world, and we do these Atlas of Cities, which we call Metroverse, where you can see the structure, the capabilities of 1,000 cities in 80 countries. So that's the idea. We do theoretical research, we do policy research with real patients, and we develop the tools that facilitate, diagnosing situations and finding solutions.
Well, it sounds like an absolute haven if you're in the economic policy space, and if you're an economic policy wonk. And I often liken an economy to a human body, and the arteries of growth is what we're trying to unblock here in South Africa by focusing on our network industries, rail, electricity, water, because those are so vital to ensure that the patient springs back to life, because growth really has been hard to come by lately. But you're the founder and director of the Growth Lab. What inspired you to found this institution?
Well, I sort of somewhat stumbled into it. I had been an academic, then I became a policymaker. My last job in my home country was as Minister of Planning. Then I became the chief economist of the Inter-American Development Bank, which is like the African Development Bank for Latin America, where I created the research department. And then I sort of like got into the habit of doing research to try to figure out relevant problems and so on. So when Harvard hired me in 2000, 22 years ago, I sort of like stumbled into this area. They asked me to do a study. My first study was on El Salvador. And in the process of doing that study, we stumbled into a different way of thinking about growth, of diagnosing growth. We called it growth diagnostics. And when that approach came out, Trevor Manuel at the time asked me to get involved in South Africa. But then, Kazakhstan came in, and Colombia came in, and Chile came in, and Mexico came in. So I sort of like ended up discovering that this was an interesting addition to a public policy school. But in any case, I'm very much a believer in Joseph Campbell's maxim, follow your bliss. Yeah. And doors will open where you didn't know they existed. So I just, did what I thought was fun to do, or interesting to do, or meaningful to do. And then this structure sort of like emerged. It wasn't really planned. It emerged from experience.
It's so interesting to hear that it was such an organic process, and I'm sure many countries around the world, many policymakers are pleased that you stuck to Campbell's maxim, because you have provided some truly unique insights, and particularly around human capital and human capital development and know-how, which we're battling with a little bit here in South Africa. But I want to keep the focus global for a while longer, because if you look at what's going on in the world, we are in a truly unique situation. We've got two major forces having a major influence on the global economy. Obviously, COVID, and there's been a lot of money printing and stimulus and new money printed to get countries through this period, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict most recently. Have we ever seen two such significant forces affect the global economy at the same time that you can recall?
Well, history never repeats itself. So you cannot go in, you cannot get in the same river twice, right? The water has changed, the things have changed. So it's important when you are in a situation not to be aware only of the problems, but to be aware of the non-problems, because of the things that are going well. Because if you're only focusing on the things that are not going well, you don't know what your strengths are. You don't know what to build on. You don't know how your assets that can help you manage the situation. I think that there's a natural tendency to look at the problems that that every moment has, and think that this is the worst we've ever had it. We've never had such a bad situation. And to tell you the truth, I mean, the situation might get worse in the future, but we've seen worse, and we've managed it, and we got here. So it's not that this is the worst of all possible worlds. So first of all, COVID is mostly behind us. Okay, and 2021 was a better year in many countries than anybody expected. Okay, so the recovery from COVID was fairly fast. It is true, as you mentioned, that in order to engineer a quick recovery from COVID, we put a little bit too much gas on the tank. We gave too much stimulus to the economy. So both fiscal and monetary policies were extremely lax, with the idea that we needed to get a strong recovery, but we overdid it. In general, we overdid it, and the nature of global inflation has to do with the fact that demand stimuli were excessive. Okay, so, and that's where this inflation process is coming from. And then you mentioned the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has had big effects on three things. The first is oil and energy prices more generally. But, we have seen these prices come back down. So in some sense, we've seen the worst of it and the general global energy price. Number two, we've seen food prices and fertilizer prices go up very significantly. Mm-hmm. Again, we've seen some of those peaks also. And we're no longer at peak levels. And number three, a very localized natural gas crisis in Europe. No, natural gas is not like oil. Oil is very easy to move around. So the price of oil remains more or less the same everywhere, but natural gas is very hard to move around. And if you try to move beyond the installed capacity of pipelines and liquefied natural gas, then prices become crazy. And Europe is undergoing a very crazy period. So there's a very localized European energy shock. Mm-hmm. So those, I would say, would be the three main shocks. For the region probably most affected from the major regions is Europe. So Europe is likely to turn into a supply side recession because of these energy constraints. But for a country like South Africa, the net effect of these things has been probably a positive terms of trade shock. And you've seen it in high tax revenues, but you see a similar situation in many other parts, in South America, in the Gulf, etc. So it's not that coordinated a shock to all countries. So I would say challenging, yes, but we've been here before, and not a time for desperation, but not a time to be unwise. It's a time to be responsible in policy management.
Well, as we've recently seen with the market punishing the UK and Mr. Kwarteng and Liz Truss for going in the opposite direction in the face of all of these forces over in Europe. But to come back to South Africa, it certainly reflected that we've had this positive trade balance thanks to high commodity prices through this period. Even though the rand has weakened against the dollar, I think the dollar has been strong against every single currency. And in fact, if you look at the rand against the pound and the yen and the euro and other currencies, we've actually performed relatively well. So it has cushioned us to an extent. It does raise a question, and why I mentioned in the introduction around how we manage this, because inflation hasn't been anywhere near as a bigger problem as we're seeing, say, for example, in Europe, in the US, where inflation is many multiples outside of a long-term band. In the US, it's currently, core inflation is still well above 5%, headline inflation over 8%. The target for the Fed is 2%. So you can understand aggressive rate hikes in those economies. However, we've got our own issues, and clearly our Reserve Bank has had to follow in lockstep, partly to protect the currency. But how do you think we should be managing through this period as a country from a policy perspective, both from monetary policy and a fiscal policy perspective, to ensure that we can emerge relatively healthy at the end of this crisis?
Well, first of all, let's separate some of the instruments. The reason why you have contained inflation is because the Reserve Bank was among the first banks to act on the inflation prospects. It acted almost a year ago, when the rest of the major banks, the Fed, the European Bank, the Bank of England, were sleeping in the doldrums. So I think you benefited enormously from having an independent monetary policy that was well managed. As people in this industry say, you didn't fall behind the curve. While the other central banks are playing catch up. Inflation went over control. But even now, with all of these interest rate increases, the US is barely at 3.5% policy rate. So they fell really, really very much behind the curve. So I would credit Lesetia Cambiano for a very good management of monetary policy. On the fiscal side, you're really not in a comfortable situation. The debt to GDP ratio has been rising very significantly. But, if you're Japan and you're borrowing at 0% interest rate, it really doesn't matter how much you borrow, because the interest burden of that is very small. Okay. I like to look at the interest burden to tax revenue ratio. And that has been rising very significantly in South Africa. And the medium-term plans is that it will keep on rising. So I think that your fiscal policy is already maxed out. And if anything, signs that you're going to be tightening are going to be very valuable and useful. We already are seeing in South Africa a relatively steep yield curve, which means, you've already lost your investment grade. So I would like to see fiscal policy moderating, so that we don't create any financial dangers for the economy. And then there's this issue that everybody understands, that there's very important failures in some industries, especially industries where the state plays an outsized role. Right? I understand that now you're having load shedding in South Africa. I remember the days when South Africa thought about itself as having a comparative advantage in electricity, that you were so good at electricity and you had such cheap coal, that you were going to be exporting your energy by developing the port of Kucha near Nelson Mandela Bay, and attract an aluminum smelter as an anchor industry to export your excess electricity.
Yeah.
And you actually built a port in Kucha. So this is just to tell you that you used to know how to make cheap electricity and think of it as a source of comparative advantage. This is a human-made disaster. And it has human solutions. It's really more a political problem and a conflict of interest problem, but it is a problem that has solutions. And I think that the new technologies in solar and wind are going to help. Increase supply, private supply, more quickly. I mean, we know how much it took, to be able to allow private investment in generation, which is seen as a major reform, right? Right now, for example, in Chile, there is a crisis because there's so much private generation of solar during the day that the price of electricity during the day has gone down to zero. And these companies are having trouble making money. Okay, so these are man-made disasters that have man-made solutions. And the cost, we've done studies to estimate the cost to society of your electricity mess. And it's incredible. In one paper we wrote, we attributed 30% of the decline in growth in South Africa after 2008 to load shedding and to the electricity mess. We estimated that a significant part, I don't remember the number exactly, of the losses of jobs in manufacturing have to do with the electricity mess. So you can say, look, this is a disaster, end of the world. No, this is a man-made disaster that has man-made solutions. And fortunately, you have Operation Vulindlela in the presidency that is focused on precisely these kinds of issues that fall somewhere between the purview of different ministers, and where there's conflict of interest of lack of understanding. to try to get your act together. But it is really important that you get your act together.
Yeah, I mean, the energy crisis, as we know, it's got to be the number one constraint on South Africa. And as you pointed out, I mean, a third basically of our economic decline just to that one single issue. And we can get into the weeds of the debate. You know, while we were producing surplus electricity, maybe it was a good idea to have big aluminium smelters. The question now is whether or not we should be sitting down with the shareholder, South 32, and saying, right, would you be willing to mothball the smelter for a period of, say, 5 years in order to give 2,000 megawatts back to the system operator to help restore some semblance of maintenance and certainty and long-term planning, and give you that space. And so I think what is encouraging, though, and just to build on your point, is that we've seen the reforms in terms of embedded generation and the 100 megawatt cap. That was now even lifted. And just the other day, we had Anglo American announcing a partnership with a French renewable energy company to build out an ecosystem of between 3 and 5 gigawatts that will feed not only its mines, but also the local municipalities. It'll provide battery energy storage, which strengthens the grid. But still lots to do on that front, I think, politically, because of those conflicts of interests. Now, that leads me to my next question, because in the wake of all of this, and it ties also to what we're seeing in Europe, the climate change agenda has seemingly faded into the background. And I know some here in South Africa, Ricardo, are jumping on what's happening in Europe to say, look, we shouldn't go into renewables as quickly as the Europeans. We should rather rely on our coal resources and start exploiting some of the gas finds that we have off our coast, because the last thing we want to do is to find ourselves backing a technology that isn't going to provide that kind of certainty when it comes to security of electricity supply. What do you make of that argument and how this is playing out in the policy space and debate? Because there are clearly lots of vested interests at play.
Well, first of all, the global warming issue is a super important issue, but it's not going to be played out in the short term. It's going to be played out in the long term. Everybody's focused on net zero by 2050, not by tomorrow. And to get to net zero by 2050, what's in the critical path is how quickly we can develop new technology that make alternatives much cheaper. And some people, a friend of mine, a great scientist called Don Farmer, has been estimating these learning curves by technology to figuring out, how quickly are we learning. And to tell you the truth, it's amazing the speed at which we're learning how to make better solar panels, better wind turbines, better electrolyzers, better batteries. And so the important thing for the energy transition is the speed at which we are innovating in these spaces. And from that point of view, I would characterize the present not as the world giving up on global warming. I would say that Europe has doubled down very significantly on these technologies, and the US has just approved the misnamed Inflation Reduction Act to stimulate these energies. So if anything, I think that it's very likely that progress in these alternative technologies is going to be accelerating, not decelerating. Whether because you're not burning Russian oil or you're burning less Russian gas, you start to burn more, a little bit of your coal or a little bit of other sources. That does not mean that we've lost the trend on decarbonization. It does mean that now to the desire to contain global warming, you have to add a desire of Europe to become more energy secure, and as a consequence, this has dramatically increased the price of energy in Europe and stimulated investments in alternatives. So I would expect to see out of this crisis in Europe, a Europe that is much less reliant on Russian energy. And as a consequence, I see a Russia that will be much less able to place its energy in the future. So part of the decline in emissions is going to be concentrated in the decline of emissions out of Russian resources. So that's going to be, in the medium term, good for world stability and good for the climate. But, we're going through a very rough patch at present.
And I was going to ask you how you see the situation in Europe playing out, and whether or not it looks like Vladimir Putin has miscalculated here the speed with which Europe united around a NATO which had been sort of drifting along, and whether or not this defangs some of his geopolitical power. As you say, if you're moving away from oil and gas, then it does remove some of that power in the long term. But we are running out of time. So I just want to get to our concluding thoughts here and questions. And I think, given what we've spoken about, and given that it's important to also understand, yes, what your strengths are, but also what your potential blind spots are there any looming threats to the global economy that we might be unaware of? Any places that we should be looking for dragons at the moment?
I mean, that's an excellent question, because every financial crisis has been triggered by an aspect of finance that nobody was focusing on. Most people had never heard of subprime mortgages before they all went up belly up, right? And nobody knew how big they were, etc. So now we're going to go into a financial tightening period. And places that accumulated leverage, that borrowed in order to buy assets, and that now these assets go down in price, and they might get margin calls to keep their positions, and since they can't, they have to go out in a fire sale, and that these dynamics can be very destabilizing. We saw a little bit of that last week in England. The Bank of England had to intervene in the bond market because it was being destabilized by margin calls on institutional investors. We know that there's a bunch of countries in the developing world that are going to have trouble servicing their debts, typically the low-income countries, and fortunately most of those debts are official debts, so we have mechanisms to restructure them. But I think China will have to play a constructive role, because this is sort of like the end of the Chinese lending boom of the noughts and the early 2010s that is coming home to roost. And there are probably other things that will be obvious ex post, but we cannot see going forward. So I would say this is a time for very, very careful vigilance on financial stability, as we try to sort of like slow down inflation. Last time the US tried to slow down its inflation in the 1980s, it caused the Latin American debt crisis that cost Latin America a decade of growth. That was such a searing experience in Latin America that my expectation is that countries are better prepared for these kinds of periods. I think that South Africa has very responsible macro management. It needs society to support it. I'm concerned that a UK type experience where the government just does things that make no sense from a financial stability point of view, and then has to sort of like pare it back or scale back, that those dynamics might be with us in other places. But again, we've been in difficult situations before. We've managed them. We got here. So let's not get too scared and just focus on the issues, the problems, and keep a steady course.
Fantastic. And we've got the mini budget coming up next month, and it'll be all eyes on our new finance minister, Enoch Godongwana, who has so far been a steady hand on the till. On the tiller, I should say, because we know there's a lot of pressure, given the fact that commodities and other factors have supported the fiscus. Our tax take has actually been fairly robust post the pandemic, so there's a little bit more in the kitty. But as you said, our fiscal situation, because of the amount we're spending on interest, is precarious. So you can't bake that into permanent spending, for example, on things like huge basic income grants. So there's a lot of call for that. but we need to be mindful of taking temporary windfalls and baking them into permanent expenditure.
Absolutely. I was going to say that it's not that there's more money in the till. There's less need to borrow.
Yeah.
So the deficit is smaller than you thought it was going to be. It's not that there is money in the till, right? And the previous, so this is, as you say, let's make sure that this is not, basic income grant today that causes a financial crisis tomorrow. This is not you have not stabilized your fiscal situation. The debt to GDP ratio in an optimistic scenario is still set to go up without the basic income grant.
Yeah, and it shows you the 10-year bonds are delivering well over 11%. Ricardo Hausmann, director of Harvard's Growth Lab at Harvard Kennedy School. Thanks so much for sharing your insights with us here on Business Talk. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.